G'day and welcome back to Jork Talks, where I talk blacksmithing, bladesmithing, metallurgy and more. Today we're talking about knife design. Now I've done an episode on blade design, I've done an episode on handle design, I've also done an episode each on the geometries and construction methods that you can use for both of those. But there is a final piece to that puzzle, which is how do those two things go together? And it's one thing that I see a number of new bladesmiths, including myself, suffer with. So I figured I'd throw together this quick video on how I tackle knife design and overall shape. When making a knife, all of the design can come down to four main categories, and they are in descending order of importance. The first, is it functional? Does it do the job that it was designed to do? The second, construction. Will it hold up to the rigors of being used over time by its user? Comfort. Is it comfortable to use? Is it nice to hold in the hand? Is the user going to be happy to use this tool? And number four, of course, last but not least, is aesthetics. Does it look good? Are the polishes nice? Do the lines flow? All that kind of thing. Neither of these can be left out when designing a really good knife. But when it comes to order of importance, obviously, a perfectly aesthetic knife that looks absolutely stunning but does nothing, is not functional, is not really a knife at that stage. It's a piece of art, perhaps, and art knives do exist. But if its function is to be an art piece, then it is functional. If it's purely aesthetics for the sake of aesthetics while it's supposed to be doing some other function, then it's not a good knife. So these four main points are going to be the key to getting a good knife design. And then understanding each step is going to be what leads you to a good product. So first off on the list is function. I ask myself a number of questions when it comes to what the function of a knife should be. And the first of all is, what is it for? Are we designing a knife for hunting? Are we designing a knife for fighting? Are we designing a knife for filleting? Are we designing a knife for whittling? All of these different aspects of the knife are going to be important when it comes to what blade style am I going to use? What blade length am I going to choose? What blade depth am I going to choose? What grind am I going to use? If I don't understand what the piece is for, and this is the main question I ask my commissioners when I get a commission, is what are you using it for? Right? Because people go, how much for a knife? And I will say, what is it for? Because again, if I design a machete when it's supposed to be a filleting knife, it's not going to be a very good filleting knife, unless you're filleting whales or something. But at the end of the day, this is the key question in function. What is it for? Now, most of the time, you're going to think this is purely blade related. But this comes under the construction and all that kind of stuff as well, because in order to function, it has to last. So if it is for, and this comes to the next question, where is it going? If it's a knife that's going to be on a boat, filleting fish all the time, then I'm not going to choose a carbon steel, and I am not going to choose a natural material for the handle, because both of those things are going to degrade really quickly when it comes to the final piece, right? So when it comes to use. So if I don't understand what the knife is for, if they just say, I want a filleting knife, and just make me one, and you make it out of carbon steel with an unsealed timber for a handle, it's not going to last more than about a month. So understanding what it's for and where it's going are two very important points. And then, of course, the last one is, what could it encounter? Now, this comes down under the question of, okay, it is for, let's say it is for hunting, right? So we're cutting meat and skin. What could it encounter? Well, it could encounter bone. Hunters are, classically will whittle sticks and pegs and tent pegs and all that kind of stuff with their hunting knife. So it could encounter hardwoods. It could encounter, leg bones and stuff like that when cutting the meat off the legs. So it's going to encounter hard, tough surfaces and a lot of torsion. So we might want to have a grind that is slightly more obtuse than something we would say for like a nakiri, which is designed specifically for slicing vegetables. So the understanding of not only what is it for, but what could it encounter? Because no one really uses their knife entirely for just the purpose that it was made, unless they have ordered a very specific knife for a very specific purpose. So understanding that your knife could encounter certain things in its day-to-day use means that you can design around those as well without limiting yourself on the performance overall of the knife. So, second on the list of importance is construction. Now, in construction, again, we're asking the questions about how the knife will be made. The first question, of course, is what forces will it receive? What kind of use is it getting? This is, again, kind of the same question as what is it for? But if you're designing a knife that is intended to be used to chop trees and to chop wood and stuff like that, it's going to be undergoing a lot of shock force. It's going to be undergoing a lot of force that is traveling through the blade and the handle. If it's a knife that is going to be undergoing a lot of torsion, so it's going to be undergoing a lot of twisting strength, like in a whittling knife or in any kind of carving knife, then it's going to need a different kind of handle construction. If it's a knife that's undergoing very little stress, if it's a kitchen knife, or say, then you don't have to worry so much about the handle construction because there's not as much pressure on the handle in construction. So understanding what forces it's expected to be receiving is incredibly important. And that comes down to understanding your customer as well. If you sell them, again, let's say a hunting knife, but you know that this person is probably keen on prying open jars with it and cans and stabbing through the tops of petrol tanks, as I've had some people do. You may want to over-engineer certain parts of your knife, like the tip, in order to stand up to that kind of abuse. And that's something you may have to you talk about with your customer, or if you're designing them for general sale, understand that that is something that is potentially going to be used for, and you may need to instead add a caveat to your replacement, your replacement warranty. So the second one comes after the first because, we've covered the fact that there are certain situations in which certain materials are going to be more desirable, but what materials are being used? Now, if I'm, for instance, going to use mammoth ivory on a handle, getting blocks of mammoth ivory is actually quite difficult and they're very expensive, whereas getting scales of mammoth ivory, whilst very expensive still, are much more common. So if I want to use mammoth ivory, it's more likely that I'm going to be using a set of scales. But say I want to make a hidden tang, I may end up having to make a frame tang in order to use that. Or I make a full tang so that I can use scales rather than having to use a block. And so understanding what handle material you're going to use not only affects how it's going to react to the environment that it's going to, but also the construction of the handle itself. When it comes to the construction of the blade, what materials are being used? If you're using something like a carbon steel and it's going into a salt air environment, again, it's going to rust. If you're using something like a Sanmai for a blade that's going to be used for heavy chopping, then that jacket steel can actually provide some shock resistance. If you're making something medievally accurate, perhaps you want to use a wrought iron spine with a high carbon steel edge. The understanding of what materials are being used is going to affect how you construct the knife. This is more important in the handle materials because obviously the handle will kind of dictate that kind of thing. For instance, if you want to use antler, for instance, you can use a hidden tang, you can use a through tang, or you'd have to split the antler and use it as scales. And sometimes that's not the best approach. You want to use that whole antler. So that kind of dictates that you're not going to be able to use a full tang design for your antler-handled knife. So understanding what materials are being used, especially in your handles, is going to inform the overall construction. And also, what forces will it get? If I'm getting a knife that's being used for chopping, I want it to be both chemically adhered to the tang, so glue, but also mechanically adhered. I want pins through that. I want a really strong connection with the handle. And I mean, that's true of most knives, and we should be aiming towards both mechanical and chemical connections to our tangs in all of our builds. But it's especially important in knives that are going to be undergoing lots of stress. The final one is there a source or example. Now, this only actually counts if you're doing a medieval recreation or a historical recreation of a piece. If you're making a Viking sax, or if you're making a medieval dagger or a Renaissance dagger or something like that, there may be millions of sources out there, or sources from museums and local sources. You may have some in your local area from collectors. if you have access to those sources, sometimes it helps to understand those sources and examples, take measurements, understand how it was constructed historically, so that you can then construct your own in an accurate manner. So again, that one only counts if you're recreating something that already exists. These first two are the most important when designing one that you're designing yourself. Third on the list is comfort. Now, comfort, I believe, is one of the most important things that is really overlooked by beginner knife makers. I was one of them. I was terrible for it. But when understanding comfort, there are mainly two main things. Who's using it, and how will the aesthetics affect it? When we go into designing a knife, a lot of us will go into designing a knife thinking, I want to make it look cool, before thinking about comfort. And realistically, it should come comfort first and aesthetics second. Now, they are kind of interlinked, and that's why aesthetics are mentioned here, is because you do want a knife to look good. And so therefore, making allowances in the aesthetics and in the comfort to match each other is how you end up with a really good looking knife that is also comfortable to hold. The main one is understanding who is using it. Now, if you're just designing a knife for yourself or for just a random sale, then obviously you're not going to be able to custom fit a handle to someone's hand. And so understanding general shapes and general sizes and stuff like that is going to help you. And I actually have a video on that I just posted last week. So if you're interested in that, head over there. But when it comes to designing a handle for a specific person, if you've got a person like me who has giant hands, then I'm going to need a different size and shape of handle to someone who is much smaller than me. Say my wife who's much shorter and much smaller hands, for the same comfort level. So understanding who is going to be using the knife is incredibly important. And when it comes to how the aesthetics will affect it, say you want to have a faceted handle look, you want to get that nice octagonal. Now, if you want to have that, you also need to be able to deburr or blunt those sharp edges and sharp corners, because those sharp corners are going to feel really rough on the hand, especially in a knife that's being used for chopping. And so in a knife that's used for chopping, sometimes you may want to avoid things with hard edges. You may want a smoother handle overall, compared to something like a hunting knife or something like that, where you can make allowances in the comfort for the aesthetics. And that, again, comes down to the trade-off, what you're willing to trade. Most often you'll see kitchen knives with very hard edges on their handles, because you're not death gripping a kitchen knife. Most of the time you're pinching the blade and just resting your hand on the handle. And so having a perfectly comfortable handle on a kitchen knife isn't necessary. Whereas something like a sword or something like a machete or a fighting knife needs a very comfortable handle, because that is your integration between you and the blade that helps you with that swing. So understanding these 2 points when it comes to comfort is incredibly important, and I always stress comfort over aesthetics. If it looks just a little bit dodgy but is way more comfortable, go with that over the thing that looks better. Finally, of course, we have aesthetics. Now, when coming down to the design, most people, as I said before, start with the aesthetics. I want a knife that looks cool, that looks mean, that looks scary, that looks sharp, whatever. A lot of us come in with an idea of a cool looking knife, but what really makes a knife look good? Now, obviously, I'm coming at this from the angle of someone who is trying for Mastersmith, the American Bladesmith Society, someone who has studied the various forms of knives over the centuries, and someone who takes great pleasure in having a clean outline. Some people's aesthetics are going to be different, obviously. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and art is subjective. So take this with a grain of salt, but this is what I'm looking for in a knife. Does the design flow? Now, flow is one of those hard things to describe. Most of us know it when we see it, but do the lines flow into one another? So is the spine all one long, nice line from the tip of the handle to the tip of the knife blade? Is that long, even if it's got the guard in between it, does that line flow? The same with the bottom line. Even if it's got curves and waves in it, does it kind of follow a line? Is there no step? Does it have a gigantic step? Now, if there is a step in the design, is it even? Is the handle in the center of a very wide blade, right? Is it one side or the other, and looks unbalanced? is the guard slightly tilted forward rather than tilted back, because a tilted rearward guard is going to look slightly slower, slightly sloppy than a tilted forward guard, which is going to look fast. It's going to look like it's moving ahead. So subtle things like that is going to affect the flow of a knife. And when I look for flow in a knife design, I will normally either cut out the design that I've drawn or take the forged piece and ground piece and hold it up against a bright background and not look at the actual knife itself, but just the silhouette. All I'm looking for is the silhouette. And in that silhouette, I should see no points where my eyes kind of immediately snap to it and say, there's something wrong there. And if there is, I need to figure out what that is and fix it. So I'd highly suggest anytime you make a knife, holding it up in silhouette and looking at it and actually deciding whether or not it flows in design. Flow can also be an aesthetic thing in the fact that, is it all comprehensive? Do you have something that looks really rugged in the blade, but then also really, really polished in the handle, or vice versa? Now that can be used to great effect if the effect is looks purposeful, but there's a lot of times where I've seen knives that have hyper-modern handles and very rough forged blades that aren't at all angular, right? So you have a lot of angles and sharp facets on a handle, but then all rounding and smooth polishes and stuff like that on the blade. It looks completely uncanny and it doesn't look great. It doesn't spark joy in me. And so I'm going to look for aesthetic flow in that aspect as well. Am I looking at something that looks like it was all one piece, or does it look like it was two knives that were broken in half and then smashed together? And then the last one is, do the embellishments add or detract from the design? Now, embellishments are things like adding Damascus, adding jeweling, adding engraving, adding inlay, using various kinds of exotic handle materials like mammoth ivory. Do they add or do they detract from the overall design? So if I'm looking at it from the point of view of, this is a rugged, like hunting knife, am I looking for mammoth ivory scales at that point? Am I looking for Damascus at that point? If the knife design is rugged and rough and all this kind of stuff, and definitely not an elegant piece, then all of those elegant details of Damascus and like the very fine pattern Damascus, at least, some rough pattern Damascus can look quite nice in rugged form. But all of that fine stuff like jewelry inlay and all that kind of stuff isn't going to look good on a rough working piece. Whereas a fine dagger that's supposed to be, ornate, if that looks specifically rough, then it just doesn't fit with the design. So you don't want to try and polish a turd, and throwing a Damascus blade on a bad design is not going to save it. It's actually going to make it look worse. I've seen a number of blades that the overall flow of the design was not conducive to a decent piece, and they just thrown Damascus in there to try and distract from the fact that the blade's design was not great. And the problem was that it meant that I was looking at the overall design and saying, well, if you took the time to make the Damascus, you should have taken time to make the blade right. And this is why I always say, make monosteel blades first, because you'll always learn better control of your design in monosteel, and then you don't waste your time and waste a lot of steel making Damascus for no reason. So aesthetics are incredibly important because they are the selling point, right? They are what the user or the buyer is looking at. They're looking at the aesthetics of the knife before they even pick it up. But do not sacrifice aesthetics for function, construction, or comfort. Aesthetics should always come last. Thanks for watching Chalk Talks. If you enjoyed this Chalk Talk, then I have many more in a playlist that it'll be linked in the end of the card. Also, if you want to see more from me, I upload one of these hopefully once every week. So hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell icon to be notified of when I upload new videos. If you liked the video, please feel free to hit that like button. And I'd also like to say a huge thank you to my patrons, these wonderful people here. They make this kind of content possible, and without them, I would not be doing this. So thank you so much, guys. And if you want to join this list of fantastic people, you can hit the link in the description, or you can hit the link at the card at the end of the video. With that being said, I will see you next time. Have a fantastic week. Don't do anything I wouldn't do, and if you do, make sure you film it. I'll see you next time.